As violence continues in Syria and a UN-backed ceasefire plan threatens to collapse over new demands, we ask, is this the last chance for diplomacy? And what further role can Russia play in resolving the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, violence continues in Syria despite a UN-backed deadline for President Assad to withdraw his troops from cities and towns. Syrian Foreign Minister al-Muallem says a complete ceasefire would only happen once a team of international observers arrive. He added that Syria could not fulfill its side of the plan if it believes rebels are getting arms from outside the country. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reiterated calls for ending the crisis without any foreign interference. Damascus had agreed to the deadline of April 10th, but on Sunday demanded further written guarantees. Scott Heidler has more.
As the deadline for Syrian forces to withdraw from towns and cities passes, the government says it's pulled out some units from some cities. But according to activists, fighting continues in opposition strongholds as diplomatic maneuvering gets underway in Russia. Syria's Foreign Minister al-Muallem is in Moscow for talks with his Russian counterpart.
We point out that the Syrian leadership has reaffirmed to us its commitment, and we are given information by the Syrian representatives concerning their use of arms and heavy weaponry in towns. We think that their action should have been more decisive in carrying out the points of the peace plan.
One of Syria's strongest allies, Russia has supported the Annan plan, but twice vetoed UN Security Council resolutions against President Assad's government. But Muallem insists it's the opposition who is to blame for the continuing violence.
Despite all these positive steps by the Syrian government, we've noticed the escalating military operations by the armed groups and their spread into other provinces.
The two foreign ministers emphasize the focus now needs to be on negotiating an international observer mission. Something opposition groups say it's an attempt by President Assad to manipulate the process.
He said he wants to pick those observers, the same way they did with the Arab League observers. They were picked by the government, which is unacceptable, and they want most of them to come from Russia. And definitely this regime is implicated in crime against humanity. They don't want to really have observers see what they are doing to the Syrian population.
The violence spilled over into Turkey, host to thousands of Syrians fleeing the violence. This newly released video appears to contradict the Syrian government's position that gunfire in a refugee camp on Monday was not intentional. Turkish forces were caught off guard by the sustained gunfire, hide behind a border fence. The architect of the peace plan, Kofi Annan, also on a diplomatic push, is in Turkey. He's on a visit to that refugee camp and will then go to Iran, another strong ally of Syria. Turkish officials are anxiously watching developments in Aleppo province just across the border, as reports of violence there could send even more people into Turkey. Scott Heidler for Inside Story.
And now the UN-backed deadline for Syrian troop withdrawals from towns and cities expired on Tuesday. Let's just remind ourselves of the events leading up to it. It all goes back to March 27th, when the UN and Arab League envoy Kofi Annan said he had received the backing of the Syrian government on a negotiated plan to end violence. The ceasefire would be implemented within 48 hours of the April 10th deadline. On April 2nd, Syria told Annan that it will withdraw its troops and heavy weapons from cities by April 10th. But there seems to be little progress on the ground. And on April 7th, satellite images released by the US show the Syrian government failing to withdraw its military from residential areas. On April 8th, just 2 days before the peace plan expires, Syria said it won't meet a UN deadline to pull its forces out of towns and cities unless it gets written guarantees from the armed groups. And on Monday, April 9th, clashes erupted between Syrian soldiers and rebel fighters along the Turkish border. At least 5 people wounded, including 2 Turkish officials. So will more diplomacy save Syria? Well, to help us answer this question and a whole lot more, we hope we're joined by our guests in London. Ammar Waqqaf, a member of the Syrian Social Club, a group that promotes regime reform rather than regime change, In Moscow, we have Vyacheslav Matuzov, a former Russian diplomat. Mr. Matuzov is the chairman of Russia's Society of Friendship and Business Cooperation with Arabic countries. And in Westminster, London, James Denselow joins us, a Middle East analyst at King's College London. Good to have you all with us. James, if I could start with you. Now, let's just begin with the point that was made at the end of Scott Heidler's report, which was basically lots of talk from all of those involved about a commitment to peace. But the reality on the ground, if the reports are to be believed, is very little has changed.
I think you're exactly right, and diplomacy hasn't saved the 160 people who supposedly died yesterday. It hasn't saved the people who are dying as we speak, as attacks continue across the country. I think that even the Syrian foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister admitted as such that the violence hasn't finished today, and that instead they're looking to delay and look for another series of measures to implement the diplomatic track. And the Syrian opposition is saying that if there's no cessation of violence by Thursday, then they will give up any pretense at ending this. But of course, the Syrian regime adding the extra line that they require written agreements from the very fragmented opposition within the country at the last minute, without any form of international presence on the ground to monitor said effects, was always going to scupper a very fragile agreement between groups that don't trust each other.
Yeah, I mean, isn't this what this comes down to, Ammar Waqqaf, for just a basic lack of trust? I mean, reports of new attacks every day, some of it spilling over into the borders into Turkey and Lebanon. Isn't this looking more and more like a plan in disarray?
Well, it is, in a sense, a plan that is complicated to implement, but the reason being is that there are certain countries surrounding Syria, certain regional players who are very much interested still in regime change, and they are willing to go as far as it takes them, you know, arming the opposition, and they've publicly stated as such. Let us remember the Annan peace plan, what it stipulates. It stipulates not only guarantees by the Syrian government about stopping violence, but it's also seeking commitments from opposition and relevant figures and parties. And it is those commitments that are also needed. And I think the Syrian government is just saying, you know, I cannot play ball on my own. I need commitments from those countries as well, not only the Syrian opposition or the armed groups on the ground, but also the countries who have publicly voted to arm the opposition.
But doesn't that conflict with the specific timetable that is called for as part of this ceasefire plan? Because as we understand it, on the 10th of April, the government, this is what the Syrian government initially agreed to a few days ago, the government must withdraw their troops and tanks from towns and cities and villages. And then the onus is on the opposition to do the same, and then the international monitors come in. Now we're hearing from the Syrian government that they want guarantees, written guarantees from the opposition groups. I mean, isn't that really unrealistic at this point?
Well, I think when the Syrian government accepted the plan, probably in good faith, they were thinking, or they thought that probably those commitments that are stipulated in the plan to be achieved or to be sought from the opposition would have been guaranteed by April the 10th. But apparently nothing has happened on that front. So, you know, we have to ask ourselves, do we really need to implement a plan, or do we really need to ensure a sustainable end of violence? And that's exactly, I think, what should be needed, by all parties to work on.
Vyacheslav, what's the view in Moscow on this? Is this a plan that can still work?
Well, I agree with Mr. Waqqaf because, the plan is an intention. And how it will be implemented, Kofi Annan from beginning of his mission declared absolutely sincerely that he foresees that his mission will meet great difficulties because the issue is very complicated, that the conflict entered a very severe stage, and the clashes, military clashes, armed groups that are operating on Syrian soil. So you cannot stop all these clashes immediately. It needs patience and efforts, and real efforts, not declared one and refusing a real substance of the implementation of 6 points that Kofi Annan adopted. I think that it is very important thing that mentioned by Mr. Ammar, that what it will be the substance of the the goals of this movement. If it will be changes of regime, or it will be reforms of regime. If we are in support the reforms, it's one maybe technology for our behavior. But if we aggressively demand changes the regime by any price, it will be another story. I think that this main point divide Russia and other countries in and the United States, because till now I believe that the United States didn't let it aside the intention to overthrow Syrian regime on any ground. It doesn't matter. I think that it is better to to look into the substance, and no formalities can be put on Kofi Annan's road. You cannot give him chance and then say that he doesn't use it. We cannot give him a timetable and claim that the time is not reasonable. So I think we have our real representative who are objectively not connected with any sides, not with Syrian, not with government, not with Syrian opposition. I think we should, all of us, European countries, United States, Arab countries, and Russia and China, all international society and regional countries, support mission of Kofi Annan sincerely and without hesitation.
Well, the UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan is on the Syrian-Turkey border visiting refugee camps, sheltering thousands of Syrians who have sought refuge in Turkey after fleeing violence in their country. Here's part of what he had to say.
We need to maintain our efforts to stop the killing, to stop the violence, and ensure that the government allows access for humanitarian workers to do their work, and get everybody to the table to discuss the future of Syria in a peaceful manner.
Well, Kofi Annan also says that it's still too early at this point to confirm whether the peace plan has succeeded or not yet.
I think on the question of whether the plan is succeeding or failing, I believe it's a bit too early to say that the plan has failed. The plan is still on the table and is a plan we are all fighting to implement.
So, James, if I could turn back to you, a recognition there from Kofi Annan that violence has not stopped in the way that many people had hoped, but also telling everyone that it's not over yet. Is this a forlorn hope?
Well, it's difficult if your plan sets up deadlines that aren't adhered to. And I think it's worth talking to your two other guests and bring back the point here. We're not talking about regime change. Annan's mission is not about regime change. It's about his plan. And his plan is supposedly going to stop violence, and it's not working. And the opposition have said 1,000 people have been killed in the last 8 days. Annan himself has admitted that in the refugee camps in Turkey that he's visited, there's increasing flows of refugees coming into Turkey. Human Rights Watch, who I believe have no agenda of regime change, have issued a report today about the regime executing 100 prisoners. These aren't evidences of the regime's commitment, regardless of external powers' regime change or regime reform, to this plan. And that's what the debate is about. Is there any legitimacy to this plan? And I think the Russians have to be very careful. Now they've decided to support a plan for once, rather than simply being against everything in the UN, that they don't seem to sort of come out as not being able to influence Syria's behaviour at all.
Yeah, let's get the view from Vyacheslav on that. Is there any change in Russia's position here? Do you get a sense at all that they may be losing any patience with the Syrian government, or have they been steadfast in their position at this point?
I don't consider that Russian position is changing. Of course, it is deformating just a little bit in the meaning that pressure increases on the Syrian authority, because the words that pronounced today by Sergei Lavrov are obviously increasing pressure on Syrian authorities to stop using heavy weapon and artillery in populated areas. So I think that Russia demand, not ask, Western powers to use the same method to their clients in the region and Syrian opposition, because as said Lavrov, many of opposition leaders and especially armed groups and even Syrian National Committee doesn't agree with 6 points suggested to them by Kofi Annan. It should be accepted without any conditions, unconditionally. I think that it is one of the main points to accept Kofi Annan's mission and his plan without Syrian government or opposition leaders. I think that Russia doing its best to work in this direction. And after 6 days, 7 days, Russia meet in Moscow 2 groups of Syrian oppositional groups inside Syria, from inside Syria,
all right, but
and talk to them in this.
But Vyacheslav, I just want to go back to the point that was made earlier. There doesn't seem to be much evidence on the ground in Syria of the Syrian government's commitment to this peace plan. We are still getting reports of continued shelling by government forces. And that begs the question, is Russia, as many critics believe, simply providing diplomatic cover for the Syrian government to continue this?
No, I reject fully that Russia is playing some cards, diplomatic, political cards on Syrian situation. It's absolutely wrong understanding Russian position. Russia really wants to stop violence. Russia really stop killings in it, and Russia really support political changes, political reforms in Syria. So I cannot say that Russia have 2 faces in this occasion. I think that while we against changing the regime, I think it is a main point that divide a Russian position from Western position from the United States of America. I think that one cannot change a regime by force, by military force from inside, because Syria possesses a huge, good equipped army, and one insurgent group cannot overthrow army defended government. I think that any foreign intervention, military intervention in Syria are not accepted. Not accepted on Security Council level, not on a regional level. I don't think that Turkey is ready to participate in any adventure like that.
Ammar Waqqaf, if I could put this to you, when the Syrian government says it wants guarantees from Kofi Annan that countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia won't try to funnel arms to the opposition fighters, isn't that just a ploy to buy more time? And is Kofi Annan really in a position to make those sort of guarantees?
Well, obviously, it's not Mr. Annan who's going to make the guarantees, but probably broker such guarantees. I think it's for the international community to put some pressure on these countries, on these regional players who, again, have publicly voted to keep this thing going on in Syria against the Annan plan itself. But there is another technicality that we have here, and people hardly mention it, and it is that the armed groups in Syria aren't really a coherent group that could actually, if someone in Turkey says, well, we're going to accept ceasefire, that doesn't mean that, i.e. a Syrian, for example, National Council spokesman or a Free Syrian Army spokesman says that we're going to agree to this, that doesn't mean that the armed groups on the ground are going to adhere to such commitments at all. It's a very fragmented opposition, and this complicates the matter a little bit more. So we have 2 spheres that we have to work on in order to guarantee. If the opposition is so
fragmented, as you acknowledge, then how can you expect them to be speaking with one voice? How can you get any sort of guarantees that that they will keep up their end of it?
Well, this is the issue we're having. We have 2 spheres of guarantees that we need to look at. First of all, we need to guarantee, hence the written guarantees, request of the Syrian government from those armed groups. And you also have to have guarantees from the supporting countries in the region who support these armed groups. And that is the only thing, if ever, that could make this plan work, actually, in my opinion. Otherwise, if the Syrian army withdraws from area like, say, Bab Amr or whatever, Idlib, and then the armed groups regain control, it will be all over again, you know, it will happen all over again. The army would have to go, re-enter and free the people who are taken hostage by these armed groups and intimidated, and it's going to be the same cost, the same collateral damage that happened before and we've seen. So I think we have to play this very careful, and nations should exert some pressure instead of announcing all these, you know, money that is going to be sent to the armed groups and all these weapons. They should actually behave in a more realistic way. The Assad regime or the Syrian government is not going to collapse. This is not only because they possess weapons, it is also because a lot of Syrians do not want the central government to collapse. And that is very important, and that is the main reason why the central government in Syria has stood on its feet throughout the past 13 months. And if anybody at any stage in any country is advised that the Syrian regime is just about to collapse, then he is really ill-advised.
James Denselow, what are the possible scenarios here going forward? Because if this plan fails, then what chance is there for any other plan to succeed?
Well, I think that's a real problem, and I think ultimately Syria is either at a certain level, low level of civil war, or is fighting a counterinsurgency that it can't win. And if the Russians are truly committed to a peaceful scenario for all, maybe they should stop arming the Syrian army as well. So all sides aren't armed, if that's the argument about foreign groups. Increasingly, though, people are worried that Syria could become a sort of North Korea of the Middle East if its isolation is complete and the Russians do eventually lose patience. The Russians have to realise, of course, there are lots of options for them. They can protect the central state, but maintain their interest by encouraging a sort of Egypt revolution whereby Assad and his family leave, but a certain sort of clique of their power structures remain in place, or maybe even a Yemen option, which is not so dissimilar. However, their ultimate fear would be something along the lines of Libya, whereby the civil war takes to a certain point by which they lose all interests when the opposition take over. And of course, people are right to say the regime isn't in danger of any sort of imminent collapse. However, that doesn't mean we can't look at these intentions and these gestures towards peace and say that they're simply not genuine.
Vyacheslav, I know you said before that the Russian position on Syria remains constant, but the perception among many people, certainly in the West, is that they have provided cover for the Syrian government. Do you envision a scenario somewhere down the line where if this violence continues, if the killing continues, Russia may be put in a position where it will have to change its dealings with Syria in some way, and perhaps exert more pressure?
Well, yeah, I don't think that Russian position can be changed. Even it will be changed, it cannot change dramatically the situation, because the substance is not in Russian position. The substance is in Syrian position. We have there two sides. Syrian government is strong army possess and security forces and police, Syrian police. So from one side, an opposition that was not united, not unified. They had different goals, different tasks, and we are objectively looking at the situation, and we see that no other choice except agreement, except political solution. If we consider that political solution is unacceptable, that means only another way: military, armed groups, arming groups, and sending them to troops to Syria from the regional countries like Turkey, like others. But I see that we shall have not Libyan scenario. We are now suffering from Libya. Where is the African countries? Libya is divided. Libya is lost as a country and a unified country in the North Africa. I think that we should study very thoroughly that lessons from Libyan scenario to implement something like that on Syrian soil. I think we should think twice, 3 times, but we be patient and support Kofi Annan mission. No
and on
other
that note, we are going
to
have to leave it there. Thanks to all 3 of our guests: Ammar Waqqaf in London, Vyacheslav Matuzov in Moscow, and James Denselow also in London. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. And that's it for this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us, as always, to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.